Hello everyone, and welcome to the fifth concept of the cardiovascular system. In this video, we're going to go through the development of heart chambers. This is a very basic video about the development of the heart, but I find it very important for us to understand from where the parts of our heart chambers are developing, because that will help you understand the internal features of the heart. Without knowing that every part of them is coming from different part of the primitive heart tube, it will be just memorization, and it's always good to understand better than only memorize random facts. So moving on. So the heart starts from the cardiogenic area. It starts as two heart tubes. The two heart tubes fuse together to give you the primitive heart tube. With further development, we will get saculations and dilated areas. Those areas from up to down, truncus arteriosus, bulbus cordis, common ventricular chamber or primitive ventricle, atrium or primitive atrium, and then sinus venosus. How will you remember them in order? You can remember it by this mnemonic, which is to be very attractive, stop being mean. Stop being mean. So, truncus arteriosus, bulbus cordis, ventricle, atrium, sinus venosus. So as you can see in this diagram, it means that this is going to be the arterial end of the heart, and this is going to be the venous end of the heart. With more development, looping of the heart and rotation, it will give you the final look of the heart. The venous end is going to come closer to the arterial end to give you the final look of the heart. So by those names, you know that the truncus arteriosus is going to give you the arterial parts of the heart, which is basically your aorta and pulmonary trunk. The bulbus cordis is going to be the next thing, and that would be what leads to the aorta and pulmonary trunk. So we have smooth areas in our ventricles that's going to lead to the aorta and pulmonary trunk, and thanks God that we have these smooth areas, because without being smooth, how would we be able to pump the blood from down to up, from the ventricles to the aorta and pulmonary trunk? So these smooth areas which lead to the aorta and pulmonary trunk are going to be the infundibulum and the aortic vestibule. So these are basically coming from the bulbus cordis. So the bulbus cordis is going to give you vestibule and the infundibulum, and both of them are going to lead to the aorta and pulmonary trunk. And these are the smooth areas of the ventricles. Then moving on, we have the ventricular chamber. That will give you the rough part. But not only the rough part, it's not going to give you the rough part of both ventricles. It's going to be only for the left. But for the right ventricle, that's going to come from a proximal end of the bulbus cordis. So the bulbus cordis is not going to give you only the vestibule and the infundibulum of right and left ventricles. It's going to give you also the rough part of the right ventricle. So one extra point here, the right ventricle rough part. And the ventricle itself is going to be the left, the rough part of the left ventricle. Now moving on, we have the atrium, and because atrium is atrium, so that is going to give you the rough parts of both atria. The last thing is that you have smooth parts in both right atrium and left atrium. So the sinus venosus, from the name, it's going to give you, it has left horn and right horn. One horn will give you the coronary sinus, because this is a venous end, and the coronary sinus is there. So the left horn is going to give you the coronary sinus and oblique vein of right ventricle. The last thing is what I have, which is the right horn, and the right horn will give you the smooth part of the right atrium. So the left horn will give you coronary sinus, and the left is gonna give you smooth part of right atrium. And we will recap all of these things now. So remember that, you guys, when we talk about the internal structure of the heart, we have atrium and we have ventricle. The atria has smooth part and it has rough part. The ventricle has smooth part and it has rough part. Why do we have that? When we have a smooth part, it means that we need to facilitate the reception of the blood. So that smooth part will be the part that receives the blood. The rough part means that we want to accommodate the huge amount of blood that's coming to the chamber. So God has the wisdom in its creation, in his creation. Now for the ventricle, we have the same thing. We have a rough part that wants to accommodate the huge amount of blood coming in. And we have smooth part because this is where we are going to send blood out of the ventricle. We want to facilitate sending of the blood away from the ventricle. And this is what I just told you about. This is going to lead to the aorta and pulmonary trunk. This is basically the infundibulum and the vestibule of both ventricles. The infundibulum leads to the pulmonary trunk, and the vestibule leads to the aorta. Oh, so now we know that we have smooth part, rough part here, smooth and rough. And now we also know from where they are coming. If I have rough parts in atria, this is coming from the common atrial chamber or the primitive atrium. If I have rough part in ventricle, if it's the left ventricle, it's coming from the ventricular chamber or the primitive ventricle. If it's right side, it's coming from part of the bulbus cordis. And for the smooth parts, it's coming from bulbus cordis. And for the smooth part of atrium, it's coming from sinus venosus. And left atrium, we're gonna talk about that in a minute. Now let's recap, because recapping is very important in development and in anatomy. So let's get back to this. We have truncus arteriosus, we have bulbus cordis, we have ventricle, atrium, sinus venosus. I made you a table that will help you to know what leads to what. But let's say a recap. Let's consider that this is the heart, these are the atria, and these are the ventricles. To starting off with, I would like to start with the arterial end, because this is the start of to be very attractive, stop being mean. So truncus arteriosus, bulbus cordis, ventricle, atrium, and sinus venosus. So to start from this end, it means we are starting from the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. So we have the aorta and pulmonary trunk. Now, the aorta and pulmonary trunk are coming from truncus arteriosus. The following one is the bulbus cordis. So that is going to be the smooth part that leads to both of them. So remember that the smooth part comes from the next chamber, and that is basically the infundibulum and the vestibule, the aortic vestibule and the infundibulum of pulmonary trunk. Now we have last thing, which is basically what's coming closer to the ventricle. It's the proximal portion. It gives you the rough part of the right ventricle. So remember, if we have exceptions, these are on the right side. All right? So the rough part should come from the ventricle, yes, but it goes only to the left. But I have a right ventricle rough part. It's coming with the origin of the smooth parts, which is the bulbus cordis. So the bulbus cordis gives you smooth parts related to the ventricles and the rough part of only right ventricle. The primitive ventricle gives you the rough part of left ventricle. Primitive atrium gives you rough part of both atrium. Sinus venosus, which should give you the coronary sinus and venous end, it will also give you some exception, which is something also related to the right side, but in this case, it's the right atrium. So the smooth part of the right atrium comes from sinus venosus, and that is basically the right horn. And here you have the coronary sinus. The last thing is the smooth part of the left atrium. So when we talk about the left atrium, you guys know that it receives the 4 pulmonary veins. So the smooth part is basically coming by absorption of these veins into the left atrium. So the smooth part of left atrium is coming by absorption of pulmonary veins. So remember that in the atria and in the ventricles, you have smooth parts and you have rough parts. The easy thing would be for anything rough, it comes from the primitive chamber itself. So from the primitive atrium and primitive ventricle, we are supposed to see the rough parts of both ventricles. Of both chambers. I have only one exception here, which is the rough part of the right ventricle. It's coming from bulbus cordis. Now for the smooth parts, it's coming from other chambers. What other chambers do I have? I only have the bulbus cordis and the sinus venosus, because this only gives me the pulmonary trunk and aorta. One closer to the ventricle, so the bulbus cordis is gonna give me the smooth part of both, the bulbus cordis, and the sinus venosus is gonna give me smooth part here, but only the right. So again, whenever there is a chamber participating in any part of the chambers, if it's another chamber here, remember the exception is right side. What about the left? It's coming from absorption of pulmonary veins. I hope you guys grasp the concept of the development, and just go through the video one more time, listen to it twice or 3 times, and I'm sure that you will be able to say it later on, and you will be able to relate it to the internal features of the heart when you come to that video. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and see you in the next module.